Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today on Wizikey webinar. It's our pride to bring some of the most interesting and, invigorating topics, especially like funding, which is usually a catch-22 situation for all of us, what to do, what not to do. And I'm Akriti, your host for the evening. I have some wonderful experts with us, Sarah and Lindsey, who have probably managed some of the largest funding announcements in the world, beyond and much more in communications. Um, like I said, Wizikey is our attempt to be the single source of truth for communicators and for PR practitioners, because what we have so much data chaos, and what we're trying here is to ensure that we are able to take data-driven decisions using insights and especially actionable. And that's why, if we're getting everyone together to discuss how we can change and we can take data-driven decisions with experts from around the world. With that, welcome Sarah and Lindsey. Sarah has been a mentor, friend. She has been a client in the past, and she's been an investor with Wizikey, supporting us and being a sounding board and evangelizing us at every step. Thank you so much, Sarah. And over to you with that.
Thank you, Akriti. It's so good to be here. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining. If you joined our last webinar, thanks so much for coming back. If this is your first time joining, we're so happy you're here. I'm joined with a friend of mine, Lindsey Scott, who is an expert in communications and tech PR. Lindsey's worked in PR for the last 15 years, first on the agency side before moving in-house. And I got to meet her when she was leading communications at Hired in San Francisco. And there she was their first comms person hired. She built out their strategy, their content strategy, marketing, social media across basically globally. Then she went on to join InVision in a similar role, managing global communications. Was so successful that she managed to get the company in Inc. magazine's 2018 Company of the Year list, which is no small feat. And then after that, she moved into freelancing and has an amazing roster of clients that she advises, Series B and above, like Superhuman, the nursing company Trusted Health, and a recruiting software company, Gem. So she has actually worked on fundraising, obviously, many times over the course of her career, but more recently, multiple times in the last couple of months. Every time I've touched base with her, she seems to be working on a funding announcement. So I felt like this was a very appropriate and relevant topic for us. And as we head into 2022, we saw a record amount of money raised last year, which makes the media environment really interesting, but also challenging for comms professionals that are trying to get stories landed. So I'm so happy to have Lindsey here joining us today to kind of give us some insights as we sort of navigate, this new world. So Lindsey, thank you for being here and taking the time.
Thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, not a problem. So since you have been kind of deep into this, why don't you kind of give us a state of the media for the past 6 to 12 months? What kind of environment are we dealing with right now?
Well, I'm assuming that everyone on this call probably knows that it's hard. I think it's been getting progressively harder every year since I started doing PR, like you said, ages and ages ago. But I do think since COVID hit, those changes have really accelerated. And I would say that things have become even more difficult in the last 6 to 12 months. And unfortunately, a lot of the things that were sort of professional courtesies between reporters and PR people, like saying no, thank you to an exclusive, has kind of gone out the window. That used to be something that 9 times out of 10, a reporter would respond to you and say, appreciate the offer, but I'm booked. And I would say now it's the opposite. Maybe 1 time out of 10, you get a no, and they usually just don't respond. As it relates to funding, Sarah, as you said, I used to be doing maybe 1 or 2 of these a year, both on the agency side and in-house, maybe it was every 18 months. And now I've done, I think by the end of Q1, I will have done 5 in 9 months. So there's a lot happening. But the one thing I wanted to add to avoid us starting out on a really negative note on this conversation is one thing that I'm seeing very recently, just in the last couple of months, is I think that not just as it relates to funding, but to all of PR, the fact that it is so difficult now is really forcing us PR people, and especially good PR people, to set expectations in a way that we haven't before. I think all of us probably can, are familiar with that feeling of like saying that you're going to try something, even though you're pretty sure it won't work, just because that's the expectation. Like so much of PR is just like throwing spaghetti at a wall and seeing what sticks. But I've been having really candid conversations with my clients and with prospects and just telling them, I sometimes don't know what's going to happen. It's really unpredictable out there. And part of what you're investing in is just to see what's possible. And I think that this is actually a really good and healthy thing. It doesn't mean that we're not going to try. It doesn't mean that we're not going to experiment, but it means that we're just being realistic about what we think we can achieve. And also, like I said, being really clear that you're investing to see what's possible, not necessarily in any set of guaranteed outcomes.
Yeah, I think that is really important to have that sort of level set. Because like you said, like it is unpredictable and you can work tirelessly to kind of land the best stories, but we just don't know if it's, the outcome is going to be what you would have expected a year ago or 2 years ago, just because the world is so different now.
Yes.
Since you've had so many that you've worked on, I would imagine obviously each one is unique in that it's probably, it's a different client, it's a different maybe industry or like, group of investors. How do you approach like making them sort of stand out and unique?
This one is hard because unfortunately the answer to the question of why did you take funding on for a lot of people is just there's like cheap and easy money out there and you can get a lot of money with a big valuation on really good terms. And so I don't think there are any universal rules for making something stand out, but what I will say is it's about finding every possible angle for your funding announcement, right? So like a couple of the things that I've seen work recently is your founder CEO maybe a person of color or from a different country? So I'm working with two clients. They're both headquartered in the US, but one founder is French and one is Dutch. And so that opens up some opportunities outside of the US to go to foreign press. With the Dutch founder, I was able to pitch in English because in the Netherlands, everyone speaks pretty good English. With the French founder, I will write a pitch, give him the emails, and then he will translate it into French and send it out. Another thing is there's really this like meta story around funding right now. Everyone is really interested in how deals are getting done these days because funding is happening so fast and furious. Like Business Insider is a really good example of this. They are doing all of their funding announcements accompanied by the deck that the company used to raise the round. So if you can get a scrubbed version of your deck from your founder, that's a really good tool to have for them. But I think, you can also kind of lean into like, did the company close the deal in 3 days? Did they have term sheets from 20 different companies or 20 different investors? Like that's something that you could highlight. This actually might be kind of reversing itself going into 2020. There's been some interesting stuff come out in the last couple of days from Dan Primack at Axios and MG Siegler used to be at TechCrunch. And they've both written about the fact that like there could be kind of a cooling off in funding. And so maybe later in 2022, is there a really big change that your CEO has seen from 2021 to 2022? Yeah. Maybe the first round was really easy and the second one required a lot more due diligence. When I was at Hired, I ghost wrote a piece from our CEO. This was back in 2015, and we were in a similar sort of dip in funding. And he talked about how different the B to C round was and how much more due diligence there was and how many questions he was asking and how much longer the deal came to take together because of that dip. And I suspect that in 2022, we could see a little bit of like cooling off of this crazy exuberance. Yeah. And then the last thing I'll say is a lot of founders are also angel investors, right? And so there's a kind of like this both sides of the table angle that you can take, right? So I work with Superhuman, and our CEO, Rahul, is also a very prominent angel investor. And that was something we very much played up from their Series C, right? Like, as he is doing this from both sides of the table, that unlocks some broadcast opportunities for us. He also has this really unique approach to how he's filled out his cap table that we talked about. So having that conversation and asking all of those questions, I think is really helpful. And especially if the CEO happens to be making some investments on the side, he or she can speak to what it's like being an investor and what it's like being out there raising.
Yeah. I think that that's so important because it really does get to kind of the like I mean, you have like the list of investors, you have the amount, which round it is, like what the money might be used for, depending on the stage of the company. And like that gets kind of repetitive. So being able to kind of find some of these other unique angles. I mean, I feel like we see funding headlines, multiple ones. Or even if you're looking at pro rata, like the list of people who've raised money, there's always like, 15 or something crazy. So that's super, super important. I think that, some of those insights are really going to be helpful for the folks here. I mean, we know that it's managing expectations is really important, and it is a kind of challenging environment. What do you think are kind of realistic media results, or how should somebody go about trying to manage those expectations and, achieving realistic results for an announcement?
So I think it kind of depends on like the four big ingredients, right? So the space that you're in, the investors, right? Do you have an Excel or Sequoia or Index? Or if you're outside the US, do you have an equivalent in your country? Your valuation, and then your founders, right? Like, what is their background? And I don't mean, she was a product manager at Facebook. I mean, like, she was a VP at Robinhood, right? Like someone who has some bona fides from their previous jobs. And so I would say if you can hit three of those four, I do actually think embargoes are still possible. And this is the conversation that I have with all my friends in PR, right? Like, can you still do embargoes for anything, not just funding? And so I do actually think if you can get three of those, you can do an embargo. So I did a round for a company called remote.com this summer, and they were a unicorn. They achieved unicorn status in 2 years. It was $100 million plus, and they had Excel and Sequoia. And also it's, repeat the criteria. Yes. So the investors, the founders, the amount, and the space that you're in. Those are the four criteria. So this company is all about future of work and remote working, and making remote work possible for US companies that are hiring in foreign countries. They had, again, unicorn, they had top tier investors, and we were actually able to do an embargo for them and got them a lot of coverage, both before and after the actual launch. But I would say for most everyone else, and I'm talking specifically like A through D here, I'll talk about seed stage in a minute. I think an inclusive is probably the way to go. And then day of newsletters, and also the trades. And the trades are kind of interesting because I think that if you are a pure play technology company and you're not industry specific, so if you are like a consumer app, or if you're like enterprise technology that's not specific to one industry, like Slack or Okta or Asana or something like that, you're actually a little bit more limited than if you are industry specific, because your trades, quote unquote, are TechCrunch and VentureBeat and Axios, right? And so there are slightly fewer opportunities than if you're in healthcare or crypto or transportation, because there are a lot of trade publications that are also covering. So that's another thing to kind of think of, is that being in a niche can sometimes be helpful in this case. And then the last couple of things I want to say is just on seed stage companies. So seed is really interesting. It's obviously, I think, had the most growth in terms of funding over the last couple of years. So it's really noisy. There's a lot of competition. And I think unless you're one of these like monster seed rounds that we're seeing, of 100 million, it can be tough. In the US specifically, or, internationally as well, they are covering some international companies. If you are an interesting company in a relevant space with some recognizable investors, I do think TechCrunch is still very much a possibility. Like, my hat's off to them they cover a lot of seed and even pre-seed announcements. And if you can really work your investors, they can be super helpful here. But your options really drop off a lot for an exclusive after TechCrunch, because there just aren't that many other tech outlets that are doing feature stories on seed rounds. You can still get like Fortune term sheet and Axios pro rata, but I think getting an exclusive on a seed round, if TechCrunch turns you down, is relatively difficult. And then just last thing, I would say, like, in terms of maximizing your coverage, like having a really, really good day of list that you've researched the crap out of ahead of time. So like your local business journal, trade publications, I keep coming back to, all of the newsletters, the tech sites, like making sure you know exactly who to go to and you have your pitches and everything ready to go. And then making sure that you are subscribed to all of the newsletters. This is always a step that I forget, but going through and signing up for those ahead of time and then checking them religiously for the few days after your announcement.
I do think newsletters are actually a really great thing for visibility, especially for funding, because a lot of these tech business newsletters now that do cover rounds, like they have such like you reach an immediate audience, and sometimes that blurb can just be enough to like drive future investor interest or potential employee like hires and stuff like that. So newsletters are definitely an area that shouldn't be overlooked, like should definitely be incorporated into the funding media list.
Yes. And the good thing is like there's more and more of them popping up every day, and they're relatively low hanging fruit. If you can get your pitch in front of the right person with the right timing, like it's pretty easy to get included in those. And if you can get a lot of them, like that's great for sort of your overall volume.
Do you feel like reporters now are, unless you're willing to give the valuation, like they're not really going to be interested in the overall money? We always used to go back and forth on like whether we were going to give the valuation or not. And there's always a reluctance to express the valuation. But now do you think it's kind of mandatory?
Not quite mandatory, but it's headed in that direction. So I think of all the Series A or later announcements that I have done in the last year, we have given the valuation, and sometimes we didn't want to, and we did it on background. But yes, we had to disclose valuation in order to get a story.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, I think for the audience, we, before we keep going, we actually want to give you guys a poll and see sort of what your biggest challenges are. So we'll put that up here momentarily. There's 2 questions, so feel free to fill it out. And then so first one, what are the challenges on a funding announcement? Is it timing for you, right messaging and financial numbers, stakeholder coordination, media outreach plan? And then what is your preferred way to distribute to the press? Like, is it an exclusive, embargo, targeted media distribution, or social media? So feel free to fill those out, and we'll come back to those in a little bit. Great. Okay. I like those 4 though, Lindsey. I've never really considered, it's like space, like investors, valuation, and then what was the last one?
Founders.
Founders. Oh yeah, of course. Bread and butter of who raised the money usually, because that's a big part of their jobs. Okay, well, so how do you think about timing, like of a funding announcement? You could line it up to when all the certain like newsletters are happening, or, it's impossible to know who's also going to be making news, like when you might be making news, because everyone seems to be making news right now. Talk us through a little bit about how you've like approached, how quickly to get something out or how long to wait even, because I feel like in my previous, funding announcements, there's always this really massive sense of urgency to get the news out, and we didn't really actually have that much time. And I know that you've had a couple of examples actually of where you use time to your advantage. So talk us through a little bit about that.
So I think things are taking a lot longer than they used to. I would say ideally give yourself at least a month from when you start pitching to when you want the news to go out. 2 of the most recent funding announcements that I did where there was some flexibility, each took 6+ weeks, and actually one took 2 whole months. I had to pitch 15 people to get someone to take the exclusive. In the other instance, we went to Alex Conrad at Forbes, who had previously covered us for the Forbes Next $1 Billion Startup list, and he was putting the Cloud 100 issue to bed, and so he did not have time to take that story for a full month. I think Forbes is a good example of this. Like their editors tend to get really wrapped up in whatever it is that they're working on, whether that's the Next $1 Billion Startup list or Cloud 100. Yeah. I'm sure there are other examples from other outlets. TechCrunch, if you're pitching them during Disrupt, they can be really sort of unavailable and non-committal. So I don't know if there's necessarily like big news moments that you need to plan around, but you do need to think about if your top choice outlet has events or special issues that they're working on. I would avoid committing to a date internally, honestly, because that is what creates that pressure. And when it's, on the all hands slide every week and you're getting lots of employees slacking you saying like, when is this happening? Like, that's when it creates this feeling of like, oh gosh, what's happening? I would say where things get a little tricky is like, if you're tying your funding announcement to another marketing campaign, right? Like, are you launching a new product? Are you announcing a customer? If it's on the consumer side and it's like a mobile app or something, for example, and the product team's on the hook for downloads, you might not have that much choice, right? And you kind of have to go because once that app is live in the app store, like the news is out there.
Yeah.
But on the B2B side of things, I think there's actually like more flexibility here. So I'll just give you an example. I was announcing a funding round where we were also launching a big B2B product. And I think as PR people, we have this like instinct of like, no, you can't talk about this at all. Like PR must be first. But the reality is, if you're just launching a new page on your website and starting some email campaigns, I have never in 15 years had a reporter say, I'm on your email mailing list and you already talked about this, or I saw the page on your website. Like that just doesn't happen. Yeah. And so we were able to announce those two things at the same time, the new B2B product and the funding, but the marketing activities for them were actually decoupled because the funding took a lot longer. And so we started on our marketing campaigns minus a blog post and minus social. Those went with PR, but PR and the funding announcement came later. So again, I would say at least a month, and just know that it could take a lot of time, and like set that expectation up front so that you're not kind of like making decisions based on other people's anxiety.
I got you. Really quick, so before we get to the poll results, Brittany wanted to know how you managed the announcement timing with Alex. Like, did you kind of give him the option, or and like kind of move it around? Like, how much negotiation did you do with the reporter to get kind of the outlet that you were aiming for?
So Alex was our first choice. I mean, if any of you worked with him, he's a very hard get. And this was not a huge round. I want to say maybe 50 million. And he usually has 100 million as his threshold. So we were pretty much willing to do whatever it took to get him to write. But he agreed to, yes, when this issue is closed in a month, I will take the interview. I will write the story. We obviously had to work that out with Superhuman's CEO and just make sure that he was okay. But in general, I would say this goes for all announcements, not just funding. I very rarely say, if I'm pitching an exclusive and we're announcing on X date, I say like, we're aiming to announce in a few weeks, but we can work with you on timing, because a lot of reporters will just use that as an excuse to say like, okay, I'm busy. So like, you really have to keep it open-ended because they're just stretched thinner than ever these days.
Yeah, I think that's really realistic. Yeah, and if anybody else has other questions, feel free to add it into the chat, and we'll touch on them as we go. We'll also do Q&A towards the end too, so there'll be open opportunity for questions. Okay, so in terms of the results though for the poll, it looks like right messaging and financial numbers is the most challenging part, followed by timing, understandably so. Then who your media is, and then stakeholder coordination. In terms of which is your most preferred way to distribute, exclusive looks like it takes the cake, which is understandable because I think there can be so much nuance to a fundraising announcement, and working with one reporter to really get that story right, and the kind of various elements of it make a lot of sense, versus having multiple people writing off of a single press release or blog post. Amazing. Well, so in terms of stakeholder management, like, I think you kind of touched on this earlier, like it's really important because you have a lot of different, you have like the reporter you have your founders, who raise the money and are like, work tirelessly to get it. Well, I don't know, maybe not in the last year, it hasn't been that hard, but
it works. I don't know about tirelessly.
They worked on it. You have the investors, depending on, it might depend on who your investors are that you're interacting with. And then, any sort of other internal thing that might be kicking off, like you said, like a marketing campaign, and then you have the reporters, and you're trying to move everybody in like the same direction towards like a target date to announce this. How do you approach those conversations? How do you, manage expectations?
Manage all of these people. Yes.
Yeah. Feels like a lot of herding cats.
It is. On the investor question, so I've actually found that investors have gone from being these sort of like mysterious people that I'm occasionally on an email thread with to really good sounding boards and helpful sources of advice, especially if you are a team of one. More and more investors are investing in PR and marketing. 5 or 10 years ago, no investors had PR people and they were pretty tight-lipped. And now they all have like not just one, but sometimes multiple PR people. And so I turn to them a lot for help. They can sometimes help you with connections. They can look at your pitch. They can tell you what other companies are hearing. So I would say if you're working with, a growth stage or later firm, or even seed stage, since I mean, a lot of growth stage are now getting into seed stage, like go to their PR person and ask them for help. I don't think you'd be getting a lot of pressure for that. I think you should be getting help from them. In terms of the conversations with founders or head of marketing. So I think if you're an agency or a freelancer and you're taking on a project around funding, which I know I get a lot of inquiries about funding, is again, it's just being really clear that like you're paying to see what's possible. I had a seed stage founder come to me recently, and he had his pre-seed covered in TechCrunch, but it wasn't that long ago, and not that much has changed. And I basically kind of like looked at the landscape, and I came back to him and I said, if you will find value in doing some media training and having me write the blog post and like handle the back and forth with your investors and do all the outreach, then and again, like seeing what you can get, like let's do this. But if your only goal is to get another TechCrunch story, like then it's not a good idea, because I just don't know that I can deliver that, right? It might be the case that we get TechCrunch right away, and it might be the case that I pitch 10 people and we come up with nothing. And he thought about it and he came back to me and said, let's do it. So I think you just need to be super clear about that from the outset. If you're in-house and this is already your job and you don't necessarily have that option, I think you just need to kind of connect the dots for CEOs. I think they don't always connect what they see in the market, aka you are raising this big round of funding with very little effort, to like what's happening in the larger space, right? Like there are lots of views out there and they're all investing in PR and they all want coverage, and there's lots of need and there's only a few reporters. So I think setting that stage for them and helping them understand how the funding environment connects to PR is one thing. And then I think you just kind of need to be like armchair therapist throughout the process, right? And even if you keep getting turned down, like this is part of the process, like don't freak out. Again, when I had to go to 15 different reporters for my healthcare startup, I knew that we would get something eventually because it was a big round and they're in a very timely space. And so I just had to kind of tell him like, this is what it takes these days. Like it's not a reflection of you and your company, and it doesn't mean that we're not going to get anything. Like this is just kind of like par for the course, unfortunately.
Yeah. And actually, I feel like, not that you waited, but what you wound up with for that announcement wound up being fantastic for trust.
It was. And I would be lying if I said there wasn't moments where I was like, oh crap, is this going to happen? But like at the end of the day, it did. And I was really glad that I didn't freak out to him, even though I might have been freaking out on the inside a little bit.
Yeah, that sounds good. So why don't we do this? Why don't we do a second poll before we jump in? So we have another question for everybody to answer. We'll post that up really shortly. About, how do you measure success with your funding announcements? And then for you, what is the impact of coverage, or beyond coverage rather? So is it social media buzz, new investor interest, new customer signups, new partner interest, brand credibility? I'm really curious about this one because for the various companies I've worked for, it's been very different. Some of it, results in like really high app downloads. Some of it I've definitely had previous investors come back and be like, oh, let's chat. People, employees sometimes referencing it when they're interviewing that they saw that the company was growing, because so often in the announcement we mentioned that like part of the money is going to be to build out the team, right? To like scale the organization. And so there's all these opportunities for people to join. So it can be a really helpful recruiting tactic using your fundraising. Have you seen the same, Lindsey?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there are two types of people who come out of the woodworks when you announce a round of funding. The first is job seekers, or at least pre-Great Resignation, that was the case. It may be it may be diminished a little bit given what's happening in the job market, but job seekers and BDRs, as soon as you announce a round of funding, you're going to get all kinds of salespeople hitting you up trying to sell you their software. But yeah, 100%. I think candidate interest is one of the biggest things that funding can drive.
How do you measure success? How have you, I mean, it sounds like you've done a really good job of managing expectations. And so ahead of an announcement, you kind of know what, you might be landing and what the environment might look like. But after the fact, like how have you measured success for some of your clients?
It depends on how we measure success overall. So I do have, most of my clients were setting like campaign specific goals. So I will kind of look at the total landscape of who I think might cover an announcement, figure out what's reasonable, and then add, maybe 10 or 20% on that. So, I feel stretched, right? If you use the OKR process in any of your companies, like I think they say to achieve 60% of your goals success. And for some clients where I have a scorecard and we're tracking quarter over quarter, our funding metrics just roll up into those quarterly goals. I prefer campaign specific metrics because your ability to drive results is tied to what you have to talk about in a given quarter. But we have an agreed upon media list that separates the outlets by tier. And so we talk about a certain number of stories by tier. You can get more specific and break those down into like mentions or features, but I try to keep it as simple as possible. And if the company wants more complexity, I will add that, obviously after a bit of negotiation, but I would say start simple.
Okay, that makes sense. Well, let's see what everybody else also said. Okay, quality of publications, hands down. I think that's the right thing. And brand credibility. Oh, wow. Yeah, that's understandable. I mean, so often fundraising is an opportunity for a series A, B, or C company to like establish their brand, right? And being able to land a certain amount of like number of investors or a certain amount of money does also give them credibility into whatever space that they're operating in. So totally agree with that. Amazing. Well, I wanted, before we head into the question section, I wanted to see if you had like any memorable funding stories. I actually have one I would be happy to share because it's too good not to be honest. But any kind of, you've obviously been kind of in the thick of it for the last couple of months, but overall, if you have any good, entertaining war stories.
Yeah, so Trusted Health, who I've referenced a few times, was the single hardest funding announcement I have ever worked on. And it was sort of shocking to me because they announced $150 million. They're a nursing startup. They literally couldn't be more timely. And they have some, decent investors on their cap table. And I first had to pitch 15 people before we landed someone. And we did end up getting the Wall Street Journal, which was great. We did sort of this like emergency media training for the CEO because he actually had never talked to the press. I used a different spokesperson who was actually a nurse, whereas the CEO is like kind of a pure tech person. And then the reporter rather wanted to do an email Q&A, which I had never had happen before that we did an exclusive with an outlet like the Wall Street Journal, and he wanted an email Q&A. So all of this really expensive media coaching that I had lined up for our CEO was all for naught. And then the reporter wrote on the wrong day. He was supposed to write on a Wednesday and he wrote on a Tuesday. And I obviously didn't see the story for a few hours. Yeah. So it was like at every step of the way, a lot of mishaps. And as you said, Sarah, like it all turned out well. We got great coverage for them. And the executive team was like very understanding about the unplanned change in date, but it was painful, really painful.
Did you have to manage him after the fact, or he just went with Tuesday? Was he apologetic?
He was apologetic. I think there was some miscommunication with the editors on the Venture Pro team, so the story got triggered a day earlier than it was supposed to, which isn't the end of the world, but that stuff reflects on the PR person, even though we know that we have zero control over it.
Yeah. Did you have to go then go push out your embargo list quickly?
Well, he had the exclusive, so it was day of. But yes,
Okay.
I did. And in a way, it was a little bit of a blessing because I think most of you have done exclusives know, you get the exclusive on the morning of, and then other stuff kind of trickles out. But people don't always understand the difference between an embargo and exclusive. And so there's that moment between the day of coverage that you're pitching and the exclusive that takes a beat. And in this instance, everything kind of came quickly because the story posted in the afternoon. I started pitching right away, and I didn't share the story with the company until the next morning. And so I had a lot of other stories to share at the same time.
Oh, okay. Okay. That's great. Yeah.
So let's hear yours.
Mine. I was head of comms at Blockchain, and it was my first PR. I had just joined. They were announcing their Series B. We had some big investors, including Google Ventures, and Lightspeed, and then a big fund Star, which is German. And so I had gone with, we wanted broad coverage because it was global, and the company's headquartered in London, but it had US, these US investors. So I'd gone with a US based reporter who was in San Francisco, and we had agreed on the exclusive. We did the call, we did the briefing call. We chatted with her for an hour and a half, told her the timing and the way that so she had the print exclusive, so to speak. And we also were doing Bloomberg television morning. So we're in Berlin doing Bloomberg at 9 a.m. And there was a conference that day too, which was sponsored by one of our investors. And so the thought was okay, the CEO is going to go on Bloomberg and now talk about the new fundraise and what it means for the crypto space, because there hadn't been that much activity. Then, this print should go live. And then, I would just go pitch the rest of my list. And then that afternoon he'd be on stage, chatting about it, and it'd be public. Well, she didn't publish. So he's on Bloomberg. He's chatting about it. And I'm sitting there where is this story? And because of the time zone, it was 2:00 in the morning in San Francisco or something. It was the middle of the night. She wasn't answering. And so I actually got off, after he finished, I wound up reaching out to, and there were a couple of reporters in London that were a little hurt that we hadn't gone with them. So I wound up calling one of them back and saying, hey, you still have the opportunity to lead the story if you want to. I don't know what happened, but I can get you on the phone with our CEO in the next 5 minutes. And he took it, and that was CNBC. So we wound up doing this very quick call in the cab, and CNBC wound up writing and leading the story. I did not hear from her until probably 3 p.m. my time. The whole day had basically gone by, and she just basically didn't have a good excuse. I think she just was she forgot. And so she wound up writing and publishing, and to your point, there was a blessing. It wound up kind of bookending. We got a little bit of this San Francisco afternoon coverage as a result. And so we sort of had this nice bookend to the day, which was, I hadn't really seen stories throughout trickle in that across multiple time zones but oh my God, like you said, it's a reflection on the comms person. I had the strategy, we had already invested this time chatting with her, and then to have her not publish that in my entire career has never happened before. And it was extremely
you're lucky. Stressful. I've had that happen many times.
Oh my gosh. So stressful. Okay, well, we have a couple of minutes for Q&A. So I thought, and we have some great questions in here. So why don't we jump in here?
I love all of these questions because I actually have had very specific experience with almost everything here recently. Should we start with Lynette's question about sharing valuation? Sure. Mm-hmm. So the first thing I would say here is this is actually I think a somewhat valid concern, right? And what I always tell founders is that I'm sharing my recommendation based on what I think will get us the best coverage. But in any of these decisions about what to disclose or talking about revenue or whatever it is, like PR is just one part of the consideration set. So I think the biggest way to convince them, or just to offer like the ingredients that you need for success, is like, I have to have this because everybody else is doing it and it's table stakes now, right? So if you don't feel comfortable sharing that because of competitors or a down round later, like that's totally valid, but just know that that has impacts for PR, right? And it might be the case that they decide not to, you pitch and you don't get a feature story, maybe you get just some newsletters or something like that. And that's okay. PR doesn't happen in a vacuum, and it's just like one of multiple considerations, but they sort of can't have their cake and eat it too, right? Like you can't not share valuation and then also expect to get Forbes or TechCrunch or, you know, whatever the equivalent is of your specific market.
Yeah, I think that's right.
The seed round question from Anonymous about a seed round from 6 months ago. So I had a really interesting funding announcement recently. Maybe other people have experienced this, but I never have, where we announced a previously undisclosed round, which was our B, and we rolled it into our C. And the reason that we didn't announce the B was actually gets back to Lynette's question. We didn't want to alert the industry of like how big we were getting. There's kind of an interesting business model where some of our current customers will become our competitors. And so we didn't want to signal to them like we're taking on investment, we're getting bigger. Yeah. But by the time the C came out, like we're big, we're putting a stake in the ground. And so we announced a round that had happened, I think about a year prior. And I wasn't sure how this would go over. I thought we'd get a lot of questions about why didn't you announce this, but it was fine. And it actually like bumped up the total amount of investment that we had. So to answer your question, I do think 6 months ago is too long, because you will be asked like, when did this deal close? And I think with the rapidity with which deals are closing these days, I mean, some companies are raising 2 separate rounds in the space of 6 months, but you can roll that money into your next announcement. So if they get an A, or if they do a second close of their seed, you can announce that amount and just roll it up into either, again, a second close of your seed or your Series A. Darren Weiss, I've also had an experience with this recently. Hello, Darren Weiss. This is his question about Canadian client asking about a US and a Canadian exclusive. Is it insulting to a reporter in either market to even try? How would you navigate? No, it's not insulting. And yes, you can do this. And I've also done this recently with a Canadian client. Because yes, they're both English speaking, but they're pretty different audiences. Like, when was the last time you picked up the Globe and Mail or went to Beta Kit, right? Like, you're not reading those. And some Canadians are reading our media, but the audiences are like fairly distinct. So I would just in your pitch say, I'm offering you the US exclusive, I'm offering you the Canadian exclusive. In the instance with the Canadian company that I worked with recently, our targets were TechCrunch in the US and the Globe and Mail in Canada. And we decided that TechCrunch was more important. And so we went to her, it was Connie at TechCrunch, we went to her first. And so if she had said, no, I have to have the global exclusive, then we would pitch her or give her the total exclusive and then do the Globe and Mail afterwards. I will say that Canadian reporters are very touchy, and they do kind of get upset if they don't get the news before everyone else. So everyone that we went to after those stories had posted, like a Beta Kit, there's another outlet in Canada that's kind of like The Verge in Canada that's newer, and every single one of them was like, it would have been nice to get this before it went out in the US, but they all wrote anyways. So you just have to be prepared that they're going to be a little bit prickly about that. But yes, dual exclusives in Canada and the US, I think, are totally possible, and it's definitely a thing.
I've definitely done dual exclusives in the US and the UK before for a client I worked on last year, and it's totally possible. And a great way actually to get media coverage, because you are touching 2 different markets. So if you can do that, you should definitely.
Yeah. 100%. It opens up a lot more outlets for you to reach out to.
Yeah.
So William has 2 questions. How do you go about building a media list for a given pitch? I do a couple of things. Obviously, looking at where the company has been covered in the past. If you're totally starting from scratch and you have no media relationships, I would look at where your competitors have been covered. So do a Google News search, and then also go to their press page and look at what outlets have covered them. And then I would think about what are the key outlets, right? So the trade publications, the tech sites, if it's a tech company, if it's a startup, the mainstream media, and go to those sites and Google keywords that are relevant for you, right? Productivity software or crypto or blockchain or whatever it is. And it's kind of a manual process if you don't have access to something like a Cision or a Meltwater or a Wizikey. But it is possible, and you can do things, sort of DIY if you don't have either software that you're paying for or an agency to help you.
Yeah.
And then he also asked about campaign-based metrics to the point about having different amounts of news in a given quarter. So I think his question is, how am I setting campaign-based metrics? So I would just look at the outside of the quarter, right? What do you have to announce? Do you have a funding round? Do you have a product announcement? Do you have some other big initiative, a piece of content like a data project? And set metrics for each of those things, right? Like, I think I can get this number of tier 1 stories and this number of tier 2 stories. And I think part of this comes to like the infrastructure, your PR infrastructure, right? Is like having that media list that you've agreed, like, these are our most important outlets. These are our second most important outlets. And one thing that I'm seeing more and more companies do is widen what they think of as tier 1 outlets, or at least be more thoughtful. In the past, it's always been the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and Bloomberg and TechCrunch and all these. But I think like the trades are becoming more important, right? And if there are some top tier trades, like those should be in part of your tier 1, right? Because you're reaching less people than you would with the New York Times, but they're much more targeted. Like potentially everyone who reads your story in a trade is a potential customer. And so I think helping your founders or your head of marketing kind of understand that even outlets that are less flashy than the big names that they might read in the morning have a lot of value and are a really good way to drive biz dev and kind of like support your other marketing efforts.
Yeah. And of course, if you have questions, you guys, on media lists or metrics like Wizikey, this platform in and of itself is media intelligence. So we offer that after the session. If you want to reach out to me, Sarah at Wizikey, and want a demo or want to see, what kind of metrics and support we can offer you, feel free. We're happy to help you as you're building out your various campaigns. I saw one last question in the chat, which was, a growing trend is to have VCs share their reasons of investing in the startup as short video snippets in the funding announcement. I've heard mixed views and results on this approach. Lindsey, have you done any video?
I haven't, but this is an interesting tactic. I would say this is more of a marketing tactic than a PR tactic. I think that if your VCs are going to be helpful to you in any way in terms of securing media coverage, it's by doing an interview with the reporter or providing a quote, less so in a video. So I think it could certainly be a nice way to help candidates or potential customers who are on your website kind of get a better understanding of like, why did this investor invest in this company? But I'm not sure that it's going to move the needle that much for you in terms of PR.
Yeah. Amazing. Well, with that, I think if anybody has any last questions, feel to pop them in. But I think otherwise we've kind of covered sort of all the do's and don'ts related to funding. And I'm really, like you said, I'm curious to see if it slows down. It feels like there's still a fair amount of, spillover investing from 2021. So we'll have to see what happens in 2022. But if anything, regardless of, whether it's like a busy funding year or not, I think that the insights you shared today, Lindsey, are obviously very helpful. Jeff jumped in really quick. Any good tier 2 outlets for exclusive outside of TechCrunch? That should be Axios, Forbes, BI.
Jeff, that is a great question.
Off the top of your head, run through your media list.
Well, okay, not to be a jerk, but I would actually say VentureBeat is more tier 2 these days. They've really declined in influence. I actually think coming back to the trades, I think a trade is actually a pretty good option here if there is a really good trade in your industry. Again, it's funny because I think that people are so enamored of the big mainstream media outlets. But at the end of the day, I think when it comes to driving business results, like getting in front of those readers who are in your industry is super powerful. And maybe it's not going to have the logo on like your press page that you're hoping for, but I do think it's going to help you with everything else. And so if you couldn't get any of those, that's what I would do, is go to a trade publication.
Yeah. Amazing. That's really good insight. I remember being really surprised after doing an announcement, finding out that like payments.com wound up driving a significant amount of traffic for downloads. And it makes sense. Like it was, I was in crypto for that client, or for that at that time. And it wasn't anybody I had ever pitched before, but then I put them on my list because I was like, well, it seems to be working. So in the future, I included them, and it was really, really helpful. They did have a lot of influence, more so than I realized.
I have also found that about payments.com.
I know. They're a sneaky one. If anyone's in the finance space, go pitch payments. You will be pleasantly surprised.
There's some sleeper hits in the trade world for sure. In every industry.
That's true. Okay. Well, with that, everyone, we're so appreciative of you taking your time today to, join us on this webinar and learn about funding announcements. Lindsey, thank you so much for, providing us your insights. You obviously, you're an expert. You've been doing this for a long time. And I know you have a couple of, upcoming funding announcements that we'll be excited to see land here shortly. For anybody else that jumped off or, wants a recording and reference this later, we'll be sending out a follow-up. You can also find a follow-up of the recording on Wizikey's website under webinars. So, and then I'm looking forward to hosting a few more people later this spring. So keep an eye out. Well, I'll invite some other fascinating professionals to, give us their insights on other topics. So watch this space. With that, thank you so much for joining us, and hope you have a really great rest of your day.
Thank you, Sarah.